everyone. Welcome into the Her Hoop Stats podcast. It is Friday, October 3rd. Crazy. Yes, we are into October. It is game day, game one of the finals, and we will, of course, get into all that. But first, I am Jamie Steyer Johnson alongside Brittany Carper, and special guest today, we've got Chloe Peterson here from the Indy Star. We're going to kick off talking about some fever, some news there. We're going to get into some of the goings on around the league as well. But Chloe, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So Chloe, you work for the Indy Star. You said you were out in Vegas. You've been, covering this team. You have spent time in the heartland, the homeland of Caitlin Clark there at Iowa. Just tell the people a little bit about kind of what you're doing now, your background for anyone who hasn't encountered a ton of your work before.
Yeah, I mean, I first went to Iowa from 2019 to 2023, covered Iowa women's basketball, Iowa football, Caitlin Clark years for our college newspaper, the Daily Iowan. And then I moved out to Indianapolis in May 2023 and got a job at Indianapolis Star. And then that's kind of where it all, blew up from there, I'd say. Obviously, I covered the 2023 fever season when Aaliyah Boston was drafted, and they started that kind of rebuild, build up. And then 2024, they got the number one pick again. And then Caitlin Clark was drafted, and it kind of all blew up from there.
So it's all really kind of laid out pretty well for you there. It's like this was all just set up perfectly for you to have like the background, the context, all that fun stuff. So super excited to get some of your insights here on fever season as a whole. Obviously a tough ending to it, but I want to start there. I feel like, I don't know about you, Brittany, or you, Chloe, I don't think I'm seeing nearly enough discussion of what happened to Kelsey Mitchell. Obviously people were upset. They were, discussing how tough it was for her to go out. For the reveal for it to be rhabdomyolysis, to me, is massive. We've talked all season, you and I, especially Brittany, about condensing the season, adding in more games, adding in additional postseason games, and how that could be so taxing on players. And this is the natural result. So just talk a little bit, Chloe, about what you're hearing, what you heard from the team. Obviously have really rallied around her. And she said she's on the road to recovery, but just how difficult is it to know that that's how the season ended? And just the kind of the hurt, like the ache of what could be.
Yeah, I mean, first with Kelsey's rhabdomyolysis, that was something I hadn't really heard of in a women's basketball or even like basketball as a whole context. I mean, I talked to other people about it too, and even asked Steph White about it. She had never heard about it in, basketball, but she'd heard about it with football and possibly, and that's where I'd heard about it too. But that was just a very scary moment, specifically with Kelsey, I would say, because at first, in Las Vegas, we sit behind the baseline, and she kind of went down on the opposite baseline. So nobody really knew what was going on. Somebody thought we thought it was her knee or something, but then, we figured it out as it went on. And that was just a very unexpected moment, I would say, and kind of scary thing to see. We didn't really know what was going on there, but kind of when it comes to that, I feel like that's kind of a encapsulation of maybe the fever season as a whole. Like I wrote about it a little bit after the game, where maybe if Kelsey Mitchell obviously didn't get rhabdo, or Aaliyah Boston didn't foul out with 26 seconds left in regulation and she could have played in overtime, maybe they would have beaten the Aces. But they've just been unlucky this entire season, obviously, with Caitlin Clark limited to 13 games. Sydney Colson, Ari McDonald going down at the beginning of August, Sophie Cunningham tearing her MCL out for the season, middle of August. Like, there was just a lot of unlucky things that happened for them. And I still think it was very unexpected, inexplicable that they made it to overtime of a decisive Game 5 in the semifinals.
Yeah, it's been so impressive just to watch them thrive in the face of any kind of adversity for sure. Brittany looked like you had something to say.
Yeah, I was just gonna again highlight for that to happen to a professional athlete, the rhabdomyolysis is a big wake up call,
Mhm.
especially for the league. Like you and I have touched on, just with the schedule and it being condensed. And like Kelsey Mitchell said, she had never played that long, obviously that hard. That is so taxing on the body. And to think that happened to a professional athlete that has access to so many you know trainers and dietitians and nutritionists and things that I think that even the average athlete doesn't is hopefully I think something that can be really highlighted going forward in terms of how they need the rest, how the body has to be able to have time to recover, because even someone who I would imagine takes care of her body, has played professional basketball for a very long time and was had that happen. I hope that isn't something that just kind of goes away, and that it is something that can be focused on going forward.
And we're going to talk here in a couple minutes about some of that going forward, CBA, things like that. And I think that the scheduling definitely needs to be a big aspect of that. But first, I want to cover a little bit more here on the Fever since we've got you, Chloe. You said you were there for the postseason run, exit interviews. It seemed like the team was obviously you don't want to lose. You want to keep playing, but it seemed like in the face of every new instance of adversity, it was next woman up, next player up. Like the positivity, the belief in the team didn't waver. And so how much does that impact the Fever going forward, where guess what? Whole bunch of uncertainty ahead still, but if you dealt with this season, what could possibly get you going forward?
Yeah, I think Steph White talks a lot about, or she talked a lot about in the regular season, the postseason. She said there's no substitute for experience. And I think that this experience for a lot of the players, like even the injured players like Caitlin or Sophie Cunningham, or the players that came on in hardship like Odyssey Sims, Ariel Powers, Ari McDonald, who originally came to the Fever on a hardship in June and then kind of got signed on later and then also got hurt. Like, I think a lot of it is going to help them in the long run. And that's also something that Caitlin mentioned in her exit interview, where she talked about, maybe in a few years down the line, she's going to look at this season as something that shaped her into the player she will become. So obviously it's frustrating right now for her to have these 4 different injuries, the left ankle sprain and everything that went on with her this season. But in a couple years, she's going to see this season as something that gave her new perspective, looking at the game from a different place, seeing the game as a whole from the sideline will really help her in the future.
And this is someone that just hasn't missed games, right? And so, like, to get that sideline experience, Brittany, you know a little bit about, watching from the sidelines and getting that perspective. Just that is definitely a huge boost for someone who already knows the game well. Now you just are leveling up that experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I think she will probably look back on this season and have gained a lot, just because there are so many nuances to the game that, when you're out on the court, you don't necessarily see, but from the sideline, you do. So I think this could be a springboard to even more of a successful career for her. Chloe, I did have another question. In the exit interviews yesterday, Steph White touched on this a couple different times about Caitlin and mechanical tweaks. Have you been privy to any information as to what those might be in terms of Caitlin's game? Because it sounds like maybe they noticed something in the way she plays, or whatever it is that could maybe be attributed to her injuries. And so I was just kind of wanted to follow up and see if you had any more information on that.
I haven't heard anything like specifically, but Steph talked about, Caitlin mentioned too, like overcompensation, which was kind of something that contributed to her recurring injuries, where I think when she had the left quad strain at the beginning of the season, she started overcompensating a little bit with her other muscles, and that could have led to the left groin injury. And then, working back from the left groin injury, she overcompensated, and that led to the right groin injury kind of thing. So I thought, Steph was kind of referring to it in that way, where making sure she's using all of her muscles correctly and making sure to not overcompensate, which could lead to obviously yet a different muscle injury as well.
Last kind of thing on specifically fever from me. Looking ahead, as we said before we started recording, we're not going to get into all the prognostication of what could happen here in the off season because, as we all know, it is the Wild West. There's no way of knowing. But assuming there's a season, as Kelsey Mitchell alluded to, the Fever have made it very clear that bringing Kelsey Mitchell back is a top priority. They still have, Caitlin coming back. They've got Aaliyah, and then they've got some players that they've really integrated in a big way. And so there's been a lot of players that have had success in Indiana that have maybe not had as big of an opportunity elsewhere, or just haven't slotted in quite as well as they did there. And so it does seem like they have a really terrific base going forward, and then a lot of options for directions to go. So what are you kind of hearing as far as feelings going forward, knowing, okay, we have these really great young players, the breakout season that Kelsey Mitchell had, which is saying something because it's not like she's been a slouch for the rest of her career, but just to have those pieces able to hopefully come together healthy next year.
Yeah, I think obviously they have Caitlin Clark, Aaliyah Boston under contract next year, as well as Michaela Timpson. But those are the only three they have under actual contract, assuming there is a season. Lexi Hall said yesterday, she loves it in Indianapolis. Her fiance moved out here from Stanford. They bought a house here together. So she really talked about building a life here, and she's a restricted free agent. So she made it pretty clear she wanted to return, which would be, even if she's not in the starting lineup with a healthy roster, she's a very good, obviously, role player off the bench to bring a little bit of that spark. Then obviously with Kelsey Mitchell too, she's an unrestricted free agent, but she can get court again, once again, assuming that doesn't change in the new CBA. And she talked a little bit about it yesterday as well. And she is very close with her family, especially after her dad died March of last year. So she talks a lot with her family on, what would be best for them and what would be best, for their family as a whole. But they also live in Cincinnati, where she's from, which is an hour and a half or 2 hours from Indianapolis. So she's pretty close distance-wise to her family in India as well. And she also talked very highly of the franchise too, in it being her second home and something that, has really helped her grow in, the 8 years she's been in Indianapolis. So I think obviously Amber Cox, as you mentioned, said Kelsey Mitchell is their number one priority. And I think they're going to act on that same as they did last year. So I think a lot of their core pieces seem to be on track of coming back. And Sophie Cunningham, too, she obviously missed the last 15 so games of the season. But she seemed like she very enjoyed her year here compared to like when she was in Phoenix. But obviously she said she's going to explore other opportunities as an unrestricted free agent too. But it seems like she would be, partial toward coming back as well.
All right. So real quick before we let you go, Chloe, you mentioned before we started recording that you, when you were out in Vegas, kind of discussed some of the wider league goings on. I'll say, especially, having to do with Nafisa Collier, her statement had some discussion from Fever players and exit interviews. Asia Wilson, talked about how it kind of ground her gears to hear some of the direct quotes from Commissioner Kathy Engelbert. Obviously, Nafisa Collier, very intentional with giving direct quotes. And if any of those were inaccurate, you would think that would probably have been called out as such, and they were not. And so definitely some interesting statements there. What did you kind of hear from some of the players you spoke to following those comments and what you've been hearing from exit interviews, things like that out of Indianapolis?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things is that it seems like Nafisa Collier didn't tell anyone she was doing it. We talked to Lexi Hull and Chelsea Gray kind of directly after it happened. Like the Fever players were watching her statement on the court before they came over to talk to the media. And it seemed like, they didn't tell the player reps, which is one thing too. But then we also talked to Brianna Turner, who is on the WNBPA executive committee. And she said, the committee hadn't heard of it either. So I thought that was interesting. And it kind of seemed like, Collier took it upon herself to do it. Obviously, she also didn't tell Caitlin that she was going to mention her in terms of the salaries, endorsement money thing either. But I think the resounding thing is that all of the players agreed with what she said. Chelsea Gray talked about how they haven't really agreed on a singular issue when it comes to the big things that they're trying to negotiate in the CBA. And Sophie Cunningham yesterday in exit interviews said she was tired of the league, and there are people who might be really great business people in the WNBA, but they don't know shit about basketball, which was one of her direct quotes. So I think there's a lot of tension in between, the league and the players right now. And obviously Kathy Engelbert is going to talk tonight as well. And Sophie did also mention that the players were kind of having a roundup call yesterday after exit interviews. They were having kind of a roundup call to just get all the players on the same page with everything. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that continues, especially with what Engelbert says tonight ahead of the finals, and then as the deadline obviously looms of October 31st.
Yeah, and I want to say I think a lot of what I have heard from the players is the overarching theme of just kind of missing the human element of leadership. And I think Caitlin touched on leadership. I know Sophie did, and obviously Nafisa, and you saw Elena Deladon come out, and so I just, that part to me is so important in just terms of like the basketball coaching world and structure of how developing relationships really in any form of leadership is so important. And I think that has been missed in the league. And I think a lot of players are really voicing that out now. And so did you get some sense of that as well, as just like missing kind of that relationship building human element of the leadership?
I kind of did in that sense. Like, obviously, as you mentioned, Caitlin talked about relationships being a big part. Sophie touched on it. And it seems like the players don't feel that relationship from like Kathy Engelbert, like maybe the NBA feels from Adam Silver. Because I remember, being mentioned, LeBron talks about how he hears from Adam Silver all the time. But, but Nafisa Collier said that, Engelbert didn't call or text her or anything after her injury, and Engelbert didn't reach out to Caitlin after Nafisa Collier talked about her in those statements and what Engelbert allegedly said about Caitlin and how she should be grateful and how they should be on their knees. So I think a lot of it is they feel like it's a good business. Like, obviously Engelbert and the WNBA like league business people, they're good at business, obviously with Engelbert coming from Deloitte, but they're not too good at the relationship aspect of trying to run the business, which is really big, especially in a league like the WNBA and just anything in general where you have a union and you need to kind of just negotiate that on an every so often basis.
Absolutely. Chloe, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your insight on the fever, on what you've been able to kind of personally glean from being there. Obviously, for Brittany and I, a little bit restricted as far as the time that we're in person. So it's so great to get some of that actual, like, on the ground experience from people like you joining us. Just real quick, what do you have coming up? Any kind of fever coverage or general coverage that you want to plug for everyone listening, following along?
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of content up on IndyStar.com from exit interviews, and there will obviously be a little bit more stuff. I haven't written much about what Amber Cox said yet, so that'll be coming up soon. And then just generalized, once we figure out, how the expansion draft is going to work, that's going to affect the fever eventually. And a lot of stuff, I think CBA wise, I'll write about that, how that will affect the fever as well.
All right. Well, thank you, Chloe. Appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Chloe.
All right, Brittany. Van. So we get through all of that. And now we have a whole other, like,
Episode. Yeah.
multiple potential hour-long conversation, the way that you and I can get into things. We won't go that far, folks. But we've got game 1 of the finals. Which is crazy.
Yes.
I have a feeling that you feel similarly to me in the way that time always flies, but right now it is truly unbelievable because we are, as we said, game day, game 1 of the finals. And then, for you and I, there's also that little thing coming right around the corner of college basketball season and everything really just coming together in a big way. So let's get into the finals. We're not going to get into all the other stuff yet. We'll have a couple weeks for that here at some point. Man, I'm so excited. These finals, we've said all season that a year that seemed like it had a pretty set plot line from the beginning, and it very, very quickly deviated. There were so many teams that just showed up in massive, unexpected ways. Um, Phoenix Mercury making the finals run. In retrospect, I do think it's kind of funny how they were talked about maybe to start the year. Like, I know Chelsea Late has said a few times, I can't believe I got blistered for how high I had them in my preseason rankings. Like, yeah, they didn't really have an easy answer to point to for point guard, but outside of that, the talent was undeniable. And so for them to go through the injuries they did and to come out of it all the better on the other end, I think that's why they're here now, because they had to have so many people step up. Then the Aces, who could have anticipated the way they started the season? Probably no one. The way they ended it, yeah, that made a little bit more sense. So you just have these two teams that have kind of been in the trenches, that went through it, and have come out really strong on the other side. And now we get a potentially 7-game series to decide it. What are you most looking forward to? Like, what's most exciting, or what has most surprised you on the path here?
Yeah, I think the Mercury, I asked this to Richard, like, about them being the underdog. But when you look at their roster, I mean, it's not really underdog written on it. Yes, you have, 3 rookies that are contributing. But when you look at Alyssa Thomas, Satu Sabali, and Carper, I mean, that is a 3-headed monster that can beat you in so many different ways. And to me, what they have done in this playoffs, I mean, they are playing. I know someone had asked Satu Sabali, where do they, think their team is playing at? And she said 99%. And I would have to agree with that. I mean, and she to me is just the big X factor. Yes, you need Alyssa Thomas and Carper to show up, but Satu Sabali is the difference maker for that team. She is a nightmare matchup for most anybody. And so I think if she shows up, it's going to be a really, really fun series. On the flip side, you have the Aces who were coming into these playoffs so hot. They had won 16 games in a row. They beat the Storm in that first game to make it 17. And then since then, you can kind of see some chinks in the armor. But at the end of the day, you have a 4-time MVP in Asia Wilson. And then in these playoffs, Jackie Young has just looked incredible. And so it's weird to say, like, but I think Asia Wilson and Jackie Young could easily carry them to the title because they just have been so dominant. And so it's, and then you have Chelsea Gray. And so to me, it's just kind of which big three is going to be better. And I think that could be a game to game thing. But I think, we are going to be in for a really great series. I think that both teams, have both had their points in the season where they've played well, but the Mercury have really just been playing kind of at an extremely high level, and going through both the Liberty and the Lynx for me is they've been a little bit more battle tested in these playoffs as well.
And I said last week that I felt like the finals could be significantly impacted, if not decided, by whether either team had a break. And after, again, what happened with Kelsey Mitchell, put into a pretty big context of, yes, the season as a whole and then this postseason has been a gauntlet. And so for Phoenix, the fact that they were able to get it done in 4 games and give themselves just those few extra days of rest, that makes a huge difference to start the series. And that means that that can make a huge difference throughout the course of the series. Because when you're going out on the road to start the series, if you have that rest and you already have a bench that you're very comfortable playing, which is certainly the case for Phoenix, that's going to be a really big boost. And so I'm curious to see how they come out of the gate tonight. I think that Vegas obviously is going to be motivated. They're going to be ready to go. They're going to be game planning for what the Mercury bring to the table. But I do think there is a significant element of fatigue that can play into this, especially when, as you say, you're looking at Asia Wilson and Jackie Young, who have kind of carried the team thus far in the playoffs, averaging nearly 36 minutes a game for Asia and 35 for Jackie, and 26 and 20 and a half points per game, respectively. Like that's a lot coming from 2 people. And so that's great production from them. But when you're not getting maybe quite as much production from the rest of the team, if that fatigue does kick in, or even if fatigue kicks in and that ends up in some foul trouble or, something like that, it just feels like the margin for error is a little bit slimmer for the Aces because of all that. So I'm very intrigued by the beginning of this series.
Yeah, definitely. I think that could play a factor in it. And it's for the first time ever a 7-game series, and certainly one that I think could go the distance. And you have to think the Mercury, I mean, just looking, the bench production is a little bit more on their end. And I think, but that's also going to be really interesting to kind of see what the role players provide. I think for the Aces, you're looking at an Alyssa Smith and Dana Evans, and obviously Jewel Lloyd, some off the bench there as well, to kind of see what they're going to provide. And then for the Mercury, Dewana Bonner, I mean, just phenomenal in that game 4 against the Lynx in the 4th quarter. And then Sammy Whitcomb. I mean, they've both had the, championship experience, which I think is going to be really important. But those 2, for me, for the Mercury, are obviously going to be kind of the X factors. And then on the flip side, those 3 for the Aces, because at some point you're going to have a little bit more scoring, I think, to, supplement what Asia Wilson and Jackie Young provide on a night in and night out basis. And that, could be kind of where I see that, tipping the scales one way or the other.
Absolutely. And that's a great call out there on Sammy Whitcomb. She's been unbelievable in this playoffs. Just every single time they need a big shot, every time they need someone to come in and provide a massive spark, not just on the offensive end, but she's been so active defensively. She has just played, frankly, out of her mind, like just reached a level that she's capable of, but just we haven't seen at least for a while, and not really in this role. So she is a major difference maker for the Mercury. And then, I mean, obviously, you're going to highlight the MVP, the four-time MVP, but in this matchup, you just can't really look away from Asia Wilson because you have someone who is so capable, so versatile, who has had kind of those ups and downs as far as production in the postseason because of how well she was defended, especially by Indiana. But then you're going up against the Mercury team where there isn't really an equivalent, right? They're not a team that plays like a true center, which that's not to call Asia Wilson a true center.
Yeah.
She far surpasses any kind of attempt at categorization. But if you're going to have someone that can defend her, you need the size of a center, but athleticism to match. And so I do think that Natasha Mack is going to have to play probably more minutes than she has been so far in the postseason. She's averaging just under 16 minutes per game. I would have to think that that's going to increase with the need for someone to be able to somehow, some way physically contend with Asia Wilson. Whatever that may look like, you're going to have to at least try. And then ultimately, what we talk about all the time is if you can't match up with the post player, that means that you have to put more pressure on the perimeter. And so, even more so, that means that the guards are going to have to take really good care of the ball. It means that the Mercury guards are going to really be dogging it on the perimeter, really be getting after the ball. And with the length that they have there, where you have Satu Sabali who can guard on the perimeter, Alyssa Thomas who can guard anywhere on the floor, Duana Bonner who can guard anywhere on the floor, it's gonna be a challenge. And especially we've seen some of the times that the Aces struggle, it's just sort of inexplicable mistakes, throwing the ball away. And Phoenix is a team that can capitalize off that.
Yeah, absolutely, and they've been playing so well on the defensive end, and you have, their point guard in Akoa Makani who starts, and she is just a dog defender. I mean, she can heat the ball up and make it really difficult, and like you said, that is where the Aces have sometimes had their problems this year, is turnovers, especially live ball, where you're giving up free points on the other end. But it will be really interesting schematically what the Mercury decide to do. The Aces are 3-1 against them this year. Asia Wilson missed the only game that the Mercury won, but since then, I mean, Asia had 26 and 18, 30 and 16, and 19 and 13. So the answers really weren't there for the Mercury, and I think Nate Tibbetts and his staff have done an excellent job in this postseason of guarding and setting their team up in the right positions. But you are talking about the best player in the league that, quite frankly, in 3 games you played, you did not have an appropriate answer for her. And I think that is going to be really interesting to see what they do tonight, or if they're going to take the position of Asia gets hers, and like you said, we're going to heat up the perimeter and try to limit some of what Jackie Young, Chelsea Gray, and some of their other guards do. But the length will bother them. As you saw, even with the Fever, Dana Evans had 2 very careless turnovers in the top of the key because she is a smaller guard. And so that is, again, going to be really, I'm very interested to see what schematically the Mercury decide to do on the defensive end, and then counterpoint what the Aces try to do offensively to maybe make it a little bit easier with some of the perimeter defending.
And I gotta say, I gotta just mention a name for Phoenix that hasn't really been said in the postseason. Kalani Brown. I have been so high on her for multiple years. I feel like she's someone who brings terrific energy, works really hard. There's some times where, sure, she just doesn't have a great matchup, but for a Mercury team that just doesn't have a true center. Natasha Mack is a good center, but she's just she's got more of the length. Like she's a long center. She's an athletic center. Kalani Brown is a strong center, a very, very built center, and she's got the height as well. And so I I don't anticipate her seeing more minutes in this series just because the precedent has not been set that they're really willing to do so. And whatever it is about the scheme they're running that they just don't feel Kalani really fits into, that's obviously their prerogative. If it were up to me, I would at least try it. And I would at least say, okay, unless Natasha goes out there and she's like locking it down from the start, which I wouldn't expect anyone to be able to do that, especially for an entire game. I would at least toss Kalani out there and see how it goes. See if you can get 5, 10 really hard minutes over the course of a game to give some different looks. And like I said, I'm not anticipating it happening, but in my perfect world, if you're asking me, if you're giving me the clipboard, I'd at least give it a shot.
Yeah, and I think that is something that they would probably have to take a look at. I would say maybe the reason she doesn't see the court as much is offensively because
Mhm.
Alyssa Thomas almost always has the ball in her hands. A lot of what makes her really successful is getting into the paint. And when you have somebody like a Kalani Brown who isn't necessarily spreading the floor and kind of taking that up and clogging that, that would be from a coaching perspective what I would imagine the reason is she is not seeing the floor as much. But again, that's going to be the interesting point. If Asia Wilson is out there and just kind of dominating Natasha Mack or whoever they decide to put on her, that is an option that you would look at. That is someone who could give you a few minutes and buy you some time and be physical with Asia Wilson. I think that is something that she could certainly do. And that's taxing as a player who's
Mhm.
averaging 36 minutes a game in the playoffs. If you're having to physically battle someone just to get position on the offensive end, and oh yeah, maybe you're going to have to battle on the defensive end, that is tiring and taxing. And so I think, for Kalani Brown to be an option for the Mercury, surely at some point in this series, again, over what we might see as a 7 game, you would have an option there as someone who is a very viable post player.
And I mean, we talked about how well Asia Wilson was defended at times in the Indiana series, probably as well as she's been defended all season. And who is that? Aaliyah Boston, one of the most physical post presences in the league, one of the most physical defenders in the league. And so there's precedent for that working as an option. Aaliyah Boston had the best defensive statistics against Asia Wilson all season. So knowing, I guess I said I wouldn't anticipate them really looking to that significantly, at least to start, but also knowing the way that the Mercury operate and how they're very creative with their scheming.
Hmm.
They are very scout oriented. And so obviously they were watching the same film that we have. And so that has to be something that's pretty top of mind as far as, okay, if you have any hope of trying to make Asia Wilson even marginally less effective, being physical and really making her contend in that way, especially as we just were talking about, you have the advantage as far as rest goes. So this would be a pretty big opportunity to push that advantage right away tonight. So interested to see how that goes. Do you have any kind of prediction of at least maybe the start of this series? Or are you kind of like me and it's like, I literally, like, I haven't been able to predict anything for months in this league?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I think that could be said from all of us that have
Yeah.
talked, endlessly about the league, and I just think it's going to be a great finals, and I'm just excited for the product that's going to be on the court. I know there's been so much chatter about everything else, but this season has been really good in terms of just parity and. We're finally at the finals, which is what everyone wants. We're at the championship, and so I the Mercury have been playing really well. I thought they would not get by the Lynx, and I just thought their fourth quarters, I think, are what has really separated themselves. And if you've watched the games with the Aces, even the Fever, they couldn't put them away. And so I think when you have more of firepower, like a team like the Mercury does, that could be the, kind of the deciding factor for me, is that the Mercury in late games just seem to have a little bit more. But I'm not going to predict anything. I'm just really looking forward to a really great matchup tonight and just basketball. I think sometimes everything else can get lost in it with good reason. And I've loved every discussion because, as you and me both know, like, this league deserves what they want, I think. And sometimes that can get lost in the shuffle of the games. And so it's been highlighted for a very good reason. But I think, again, to just appreciate the product that's on the court. And I know that this finals is going to give us something that we're all going to be excited about.
Yeah, the games just prove the point of what they've earned, the product they've put on the floor, the effort they've put in to do that, and now, yeah, it culminates in a super super exciting, hopefully 7-game series, hopefully a safe 7-game series. Like,
Yes,
I hope everyone is really hydrating. I hope everyone has gotten the opportunity to, get a little bit of rest. The really fortunate thing is that, as far as proximity for teams, this is at least a little bit of an easier travel situation, going from Vegas to Phoenix. So
absolutely.
we'll take the little victories as they come, and we'll see who takes away the big victories in the finals here starting tonight. All right, folks. Thank you so much for rocking with us today. Huge thank you to Chloe Peterson for joining us to start the episode. Brittany, as always, awesome to catch up with you. I'm so excited for just what we have coming up basketball wise. I know that you and I will have some really fun stuff to discuss. But in the meantime, folks, you can find Brittany Carper on social media at Brittany Carper. Easy as that. I'm at JSteyz, JSTEYZ, and make sure that you're following her hoop stats on every platform that you are using regularly, on basically any social media that you may wish to. Make sure you're subscribed to our site. We've got all of the awesome statistics numbers that you might need. As we said, you're going to want to start preparing to shift gears into the college basketball season. And so we've got all of that as well. Got all of our content coming out from our writers, and of course our podcast, the Her Hoop Stats podcast, coming out every weekday. Subscribe, rate, review wherever you get your podcasts. Really helps us out. In the meantime, enjoy the first couple games of the finals. We'll be back at you next week.